Yeah. All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. We've got a lot of information. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions also. Real quick, we were at the last meeting. One thing we're talking about for November is putting a field trip together to go to Davis and tour the FBS greenhouses and Margaret. The Wolf Skill Repository, UC Davis Winery, so we would be putting some charter buses together and getting on to that. So, are people interested in doing that? I mean, we had a pretty good showing hands at the last meeting. Yeah, so I think we'll work on that. We don't really have any really starting the logistics of that yet, so watch for that, and we'll get some information out for that. Otherwise, this will be our last meeting until November. So we all get into harvest at some point whenever Brady finishes here. So, should be soon. Depends upon the block. Right, yeah. Very pleased to have Dr. Chris Chen here today, our UC Department of Extension viticultural advisor to the North Coast, long title, but thanks, Chris, for coming to do this. I know it's an important topic for a lot of people. There's probably a lot of blocks out there that may still not have contracts, so Chris is here to help us kind of sort through the PCQs on that.
Thank you, Jason. Hi, everybody. How's it going? We just had PCA breakfast in the Sonoma County office, so I just ate an entire burrito, so I'm a little sluggish. Apologies. Thanks for having me. I also want to point out that Helene Barris is our Area Water and Soil Advisor, correct? Is that the right title? Yeah. Okay. She's relatively new. She's here for water and soil concerns, so if you have questions about that, you can contact me or her. Probably hers better. So, all right. So I'm here today to talk about vineyard mothballing. Vineyard mothballing is kind of a new thing. It's not. It's like a cyclical thing, but it's new for this time of the 2000s. Vineyard mothballing is basically taking a vineyard out of production without killing it or without fully removing it. And this poses a lot of challenges and risks, not just for the person doing it, but their neighbors too. So I'm going to talk through what you can do and how we should approach this as best I can. I also have a preliminary research study right now in Ukiah that hopefully will continue, but is kind of contingent on a couple things, and I'll explain that later. Okay, so the term mothballing is kind of straightforward, right? It's like you mothball your coats, you mothball your clothes, you put it in storage for later and prevent further damage to it. You're not wearing it out, you're not washing it, it's just there. So you can imagine the vineyard in a closet like this. That term was coined in the early 2000s, actually in Australia. They had a downturn there as well in the wine grape market, and it was a specific valley. I forget the name of the valley, but that's where the term comes from. Formally, it's defined as maintaining a non-producing vineyard with minimal critical inputs to allow for rapid return to production in the future. There's three very specific key points in that definition, right? It's non-producing. You still maintain minimal inputs not just being what you put in, but also like labor, right? And then you're doing this to design it so that you can bring it back to production as quickly as possible, which would be great. That's the ideal, right? And that's in contrast to abandonment, which a lot of people are also talking about. Abandonment is what it sounds like. You're not doing anything. You might as well not be there, and let it run wild, right? And you don't have plans to return to production. If you do, it's going to be a lot more of a headache. Mothballing is a management strategy. It's just, a less intense management strategy. Okay, so approaches to mothballing. I do want to clarify here that I made up these types. There's no formal name for what these are, but these are the three approaches that I've seen to mothballing. And the type 3 may not even be mothballing. That's just reduced farming, right? That's just minimal farming. But if we're talking about mothballing, when somebody's approached me as the advisor here, they could be talking about any of these, right? So that I put them all in here and I gave them type numbers, type 1, 2, and 3, to make it easier to refer to in this presentation. So type 1 is what you think about when you think about mothballing. No harvest planned at all, and minimal management. What kind of management? The only management you really need to do with type 1 is manage pest and disease pressure, because you want to avoid the vineyard being flagged as abandoned, right? You also don't want that pest and disease pressure to build up over time, so that when you do return to production, you have to deal with massive amounts of mildew or leaf hoppers or whatever it might be, right? With this, there's no real consideration for the recovery of the vines during the return to production. You are just keeping the vines alive. You're not thinking about how you're going to prune them and cut them so that they can produce new cordons or fruiting canes so that you can get better yields. You're just keeping them alive with the least amount of management possible. There's no cultural practices, inputs, or chemical intervention. That's not entirely true. Typically, there is a little bit of fungicide application in this just to do the pest and disease pressure, but very minimal. And then no harvest of fruit, and that's something you decide on before you start doing this, right? At the beginning of the year, if this is your first year mothballing, you say, I'm not going to harvest either because I don't have a contract, prices are too bad. Last year the yield wasn't worth it, any of those reasons, and you commit to that. You don't hope for somebody to come buy the grapes that you didn't have planned to buy the grapes. So that's your management strategy. Type 2 is a little bit more management. The management in type 2 would be still no harvest planned, which reduces quite a bit of labor costs, but you're going to address pests, diseases, and this time vine health and structure too. So this means that you might want to prune. The first one, type 1, pruning is optional. Most people wouldn't do it if they're doing a type 1 mothballing. Type 2, you would prune it so that you can bring it back to production quickly. You have those younger buds, right, 1-year-old buds. Those are typically still they have cluster primordia, they have the preformed shoots. That's what you want, and also they're very well attached to the wood. That's what you want to bring the grapevine back, so you prune it, or at least you cut it in some way, so that those buds are always there year after year, so when you're ready to come back to production, you can use them. Otherwise, pretty much everything else is the same as type 1. And then type 3, which is minimal farming strategies, you might harvest. This is the worst one in my opinion if you're going to mothball, right? You might harvest, but you also might not. And the issue with that is sometimes that's just what's left over, right? You're still reducing management costs as much as possible. Maybe you're just getting rid of extraneous practices, like if you tuck shoots instead of rake shoots, which I don't recommend, but if you do that, maybe you just don't do that and you let the canopy weep over, right? Maybe you stop doing leaf removal and send in goats or sheep instead, right? All that said, you're not managing the vineyard for harvest. You're managing it so that it's healthy enough, you're controlling pests and diseases, and you might harvest if you want to. This is the one that causes the most problem as far as abandoned vineyards go versus mothballed vineyards. This is the one that's the most closely looked at as like an abandoned vineyard. And I'll explain why in a bit. Okay, so what are the risks of mothballing? There's a lot. Vine health and longevity is the one that stands out to me when I think about this from the start, right? You're not giving the vine what it needs as far as inputs. You're allowing for habitat for pests and diseases. You're not pruning in some cases. So that can cause a lot of stress on grapevines, especially if it's done over several years. And that can lead to long-term damage and can reduce the lifespan of the vineyard. Irrigation is actually a slide I have later on, and that explains this very well as an example. But you can do long-term damage to the grapevine if you're not mothballing for the health of the vine. High pest and disease pressure, this one's kind of obvious, right? If you have a mothballed vineyard near you, you probably have powdery mildew, right? Mothballed vineyards sometimes not managed enough for disease and pest pressure, and there's ways to do that I've seen. There needs to be more research on this, so I can give you peer-reviewed, statistically relevant research. But from what I've seen as an advisor and how recent this is, I can give you some info on that. Nuisance vineyards and abatement. If the vineyard becomes a nuisance, So it has high enough pest pressure, and it's managed or to the point where it looks like it's abandoned or it is abandoned. Nearby farms, you all know this, can complain, can file a complaint. The county can go through abatement and require that that vineyard be pulled out. This is a rare occurrence. It's not something anybody likes to do on any end, but if it's threatening your crop and your vineyard, I mean, it's very reasonable to request that, right? It's also another problem with this is a visual eyesore for high trafficked areas. There are places where a lot of income for that property comes from wine tasting, tourism, buses. And if there's a vineyard that's abandoned, is full of leaf hoppers, you can smell the mildew from across the street. That is also a case where somebody might request abatement, like a neighbor. Poor recovery is the last one. The vines might not ever recover to the peak production they were at before mothballing, or they could take longer than expected. The goal, the ideal goal that I've heard for mothballed vineyards is, I'm gonna put it out of production now, and when I'm ready to come back in production, it can be that year I decide. That next season, right after I say I'm gonna bring it back, you can get some crop. Maybe not 100%, maybe like half the crop you got at the peak of production. But we'll talk about that too, because that's a challenge as well. It is harder than it sounds. We can probably expect to return to production when we wish to, but not without without a long-term low input strategy. So we have to think about how we're going to mothball and particularly how we're going to come out of the mothball when we decide to do it and when we set up a plan to do it. So these are some considerations. I'm not going to go through all of them in this presentation, but these are things you have to think about when you're thinking about how am I going to keep these vines in storage, more or less. Vine physiology is one, resource use efficiency, pest diseases. The conditions of your site matter quite a bit. Target training and management when returning to production, how long they'll be mothballed, how many hours you're going to need after you mothball during that time frame, right? And then whether or not you're going to use chemical controls in any way. Okay, so methods and considerations. A lot of these images are AI images. If you don't like that, I'll try not to use them anymore for you. But I think they're useful if you do it right. Anyways, vine physiology. So you want to make sure you have a plan surrounded around the physiology of the grapevine. And part of that is knowing the growth cycle of the grapevine and what pruning does for you, right? And harvest, what that does for you. So when you're thinking about vine physiology, you want to consider, are you going to harvest? Most likely not if you're mothballing, because with those low inputs, that low management, even if you do like a salvage harvest, your yield and the quality of your fruit will decline pretty drastically, right? Because you're not paying attention to it like you normally do. Are you going to prune or not prune, right? There's a trade-off there between vine health and labor costs. Pruning is expensive, but can you do it in a cheaper way than you do now, right? Even a cane prune vineyard, you have to think about which canes you want to keep and which ones you want to make a renewal spur and which ones you just want to go direct cane or just remove. That's expensive because someone has to think about that every time they go up to a grapevine, right? Is there a way to prune where it's cheaper and the vine health still remains relatively good? Again, I have a slide on that next. Water use efficiency. If you apply less water, will the vine die? If you cut off water, will the vine die or suffer enough that it's permanently damaged? Or if you just apply less water, do you get less leaves? There's less water demand, so what is that doing to the grapevine, right? Less transpiration, less photosynthesis, less growth rate, smaller berries. There's all these things that should be considered. And then what's your plan for recovery? How long after you decide, I'm going to bring this vine back into production, is it going to take for you to get to 100% of what you did before, or close to it, right? 100% yield prior to the mothball. That is really challenging, and I think, no offense to any of you, but I think a lot of people are more optimistic than they should be given the strategies I've seen for this so far. Okay, so a prune vine. Let's go through what a prune vine looks like. Your dormant buds. Dormant buds are new every year. So every year the dormant bud is formed on the shoe during spring and summer, and they're typically very healthy. They have 3 buds within them. They have a primary bud, a secondary and a tertiary bud, or 2 secondaries, however you were taught that. And those are very, very healthy, fruitful vines. They already have cluster primordia, so if you do, you probably know this, if you do bud dissections, you can estimate the cluster count in your vineyard to a certain degree of accuracy. It's not great. It's not worth it, honestly, but you could. So it's about 30% off usually. So they're most useful the year after they form, and then they become what's called latent buds. So they typically will grow their primary bud. There'll be 2 secondaries left, and then they will kind of go dormant in the wood, right? Those are suckers. That's what you see later on, years down the road, coming out of the trunk. They're formed, they're there, they are weaker, and they're less well attached to the entirety of the grapevine, which makes it harder to work with. Fruiting height. The fruiting zone is uniform when you prune, relatively, right? This is all relative. But you can expect to have fruit here, right? You don't expect a cluster that you're going to harvest besides a secondary like up here, right? So you know where they're going to be, so you know how to do the leaf removal. You know where shoot thinning needs to be done. You know where all these practices, where the spray applications have to hit, all that stuff. You know where to go. You also have minimal permanent wood. So you have less, the goal with pruning any grapevine is to reduce the amount of permanent wood, right? In addition to getting those 2 bud spurs, you want to reduce the amount of older wood that's good habitat for pests and diseases, especially fungal diseases like grapevine trunk diseases. You don't want that. So when you're pruning a vine normally, you remove that extra tissue, you limit that habitat for pests and pathogens, and then it allows for smaller pruning cuts because you're doing it every year. You're not hacking off a whole arm or half the cordon or something to get back to where you need to be. It also keeps the height of those arms below the fruiting zone so that you still have that uniform fruiting zone, more or less. Now, in mothball vineyards, if you don't prune the vines, and this is part of the study that I am doing in Ukiah, you get a lot of weird stuff. You got to remember that those buds that are older are down here, or these were the buds in this image that were here, right? After 2 or 3 years, they're still there. They don't grow up at all. They're just in the same spot. They're lacking the primary bud because that primary bud already started growing and then probably was thinned or removed. And because they don't have the primary bud, they only have those secondary, tertiary buds. Sometimes those don't have cluster primordia, so no fruit on them. You might get a shoot, but maybe you won't get fruit. Or if you do, it'll be one cluster at 75% the size of a normal cluster, first cluster on a shoot. And they're less strongly attached. So, I mean, you look at a shoot in spring and it falls off. So you can imagine a latent bud can be even less well attached. That's a problem. So you need those for return to production. So that's already one downside to not pruning your vines. Your fruiting zone height changes. I put high, but it should be variable because of the difference in growth in these shoots, right? So your fruiting zone here will be lower. It'll be moderate here, high here, right? That's a problem because you're getting different climate types, microclimates here versus here versus here. And that can lead to challenges with all the practices I mentioned before with canopy management. That also allows for variation in light exposure, temperatures, and humidities for pests and diseases as well. So even if you're doing well at managing powdery mildew here in this fruiting zone, it's not on your berries, it might be doing really well up here where there's more leaves, right? And then there's more permanent wood, which means, you don't prune. So those shoots you didn't prune become secondary wood and harder long-term permanent wood. That provides a lot of habitat for things like Esca to grow into, right? It gives a little more bark for mealybugs to hide under. It can be problematic, and the whole point of something like switching to cane pruning is to reduce that permanent wood so you don't have that area for grapevine trunk diseases. So this is a problem, and when you come back to production, you have to do much larger cuts. Even if you cut back to spurs again, these down here are thicker than they were when they were first year shoots. So you're cutting like 2-3 times the surface area, exposing 2 to 3 times the surface area, more likely to get infection, right? So what about converting to cane prune? This is one approach I've seen for mothballing a vineyard. You just lop off each side. You don't think about what you're cutting. You just leave what you need to, right? One shoot here, maybe a third one just in case the other 2 break off. And then you cut it again and you don't think this is the renewal spur, this is the fruiting cane, this is the right diameter, the right internode length. You don't have to think about any of that. It's viable. You can do that. You probably wouldn't retain a lot of fruiting canes because then you have stuff you have to manage again, right? And it would reduce the amount of labor needed as long as you're not thinking about it like a normal cane prune vineyard, right? If you think about it like a normal cane prune vineyard, it could increase the amount of hours compared to a spur prune vineyard. So this is an option. You would only want to retain renewal spurs to preserve the growing position. So every year you would cut back to spurs only, and those would grow out into canes, and you do it again and again. And now that way, every year you have a new bud. And that new bud could be fruitful if you choose for it to be. But still requires pruning. This is saving a lot of time here, right? Labor hours. Resource use efficiency is another concept I think should be addressed when we're talking about mothballing. Water, nutrients. If you're not harvesting, you're not going to put those in like you would if you were harvesting, right? Especially nutrients. But focus more on water. The vine responds to what resources it has. More nitrogen specifically and potassium and more water, it'll grow. It induces vigor in the vegetative tissues. If you give it less of those things, not just water but also nutrients, it's going to grow less. So you will have a smaller canopy, and that smaller canopy provides a feedback loop where there is also less water demand because there are less leaves, right? Transpiration and evaporation are the way water is lost from a vineyard or pretty much any agricultural system. If you're not irrigating or you're irrigating very little, then all the water is being lost by transpiration at that point, or a good majority of it is, right? Smaller canopy means less of that, so the vines actually don't get as stressed as you think they would, unless they have a huge canopy, which would be the case if there was late winter, early spring rains in excess. Now you have a big canopy, well, that's a problem, right? Because the vine is going to need water for that. It could also change root proliferation over time. Just like when you're trying to switch to dry farming, for instance, those roots are going to try to find resources first because they're used to water, they're used to nitrogen applications, all that stuff. And if they don't get it when they're starting to grow, they'll use their resources to grow their roots to find more of that stuff. If that doesn't exist in your soil profile, in the matrix, then root growth will slow down over time. So what you're doing is more or less putting this thing in stasis after it kind of responds terribly to reduced inputs. And then cluster size will also decrease. Cluster size, especially in spring, and spring affects most of the final cluster size, that's water-based, right? So if we have a dry year, dry winter, dryish winter, and no irrigation, you're gonna have little teeny tiny berries that nobody wants. So you shouldn't harvest anyways, right? Okay, you're going to mothball it. It can typically respond or acclimate to lower inputs and the mothballing approach relatively easily. They, again, will go through this process of root seeking for new nutrients and probably massive canopy growth if it is a very wet winter. But over time, that's going to stop. So if you're mothballing for 3 to 4 to 5 years, the roots aren't going to be seeking out new nutrients every year because they don't have the resources to. The canopy will reduce in size over time. Because it doesn't have the resources to grow. It'll run out of nitrogen, right? We don't want that really. We want it to just like slow down. And the way I look at that, which I have a slide later on, is like desert plants. And I'll explain that later. Labor requirements. This is the big one, right? I think. This is the most costly aspect of any vineyard management, I believe, unless there's steel got much, much more expensive, you can tell me. For most of my growers that are thinking about mothballing, the primary goal is like a 90% reduction in per acre costs per year. Not, like the minimal farming folks, it's closer to 50%, but true mothballing, like type 1, where you don't plan to harvest and you don't do anything if you don't have to, 90% is their goal, decrease. So that's the least labor needed because there's no cultural practices. All you got to do is manage pests and diseases efficiently, right? You need to be effective at that. And you also maybe want to make sure that your vines don't outgrow what you want to cut them back to. But least labor, moderate labor requirements are type 2, where you're just pruning it. Everything else goes by the wayside. And then type 3 is you're still reducing your labor hours needed, but you still need quite a few if you're planning on harvesting at all. So each approach has variation in how their objectives are achieved, and they all have different objectives, which makes this very difficult, right? Okay. Sorry, one sec. Hey, there we go. Okay, so just some examples, for instance. Type 1, no harvest, minimal management. You still need to do pest and disease control, or you're going to be considered an abandoned vineyard. Or you could do livestock integration. I've seen this a couple times in 2 vineyards now this year, where instead of doing traditional pest and disease control alone, they're doing way, way less, like just a couple sulfur sprays and livestock integration early in the season, and that's reducing pest pressure significantly for that vineyard. And it's not what you would expect for like running sheep through a vineyard. The difference is they leave them in there. They let them keep feeding. They feed on the leaves, they feed on the canopy, they feed on the cover crop, on everything that they can get their faces to. And what that does is it reduces a lot of the pest pressure from overwintering pests, right? Like a good example is leafhoppers that lay their eggs on the first fully mature open leaf at the base of shoots. The sheep eat that. So where are they going to lay their eggs? They probably already laid their eggs if you put your sheep out there. So that's a really good way to reduce management costs. It depends where you are, though, right? In places that I work, some locations, shepherds pay people to use their vineyard for feed. And places like Sonoma County, you have to pay for it. So it depends where you're getting your sheep and what your situation is. You can also use goats, but the goats will eat the wire. So be careful with them. Type 2. So no harvest, but you're managing for that recovery period when you're done mothballing. Pest and disease and or livestock management control is still needed, but you also want to do standard pruning just for your style. You don't need to lay the shoots down on the wire. You don't need to tie anything. You just need to cut, which is quite helpful when you're trying to come back to production, again, because of those new buds, fruitful buds. Right? And then minimal harvest, reduced management. You still got to do most of the things you do. You just do them less. And to what degree, I don't know, because it's kind of like it's a spectrum. It could be you mitigate the labor need as much as possible, and you're just barely not considered an abandoned vineyard, or you're reducing your labor requirements by 20% because you didn't sucker and you didn't shoot tie. That kind of stuff. It could be either end of that. But you do need to do canopy management, irrigation, livestock, pest disease control. If you really are thinking about mothballing, and I've probably driven this home already, don't focus on type 3. Either decide to or not. Okay, so just a brief example. I didn't do type 2 and 3 because type 1, no harvest, no management, is the most important, I think. What are your objectives? You want to limit pest and disease pressure, not just for you in the future when you come back out of production, but also for your neighbors. You don't want your neighbors to have to deal with that if they're trying to continue farming grapes, right? You want to keep the vines alive. They don't have to be particularly healthy, but they need to be alive, and they have to be able to grow next year. And you want to store the vines for later. You want to make sure that they are recoverable. They don't get a ton of embolisms from lack of water, right? Grapevines can recover from a little bit of that, but too much dry, like extreme dry conditions too quickly in the lifespan of that vineyard, that can lead to severe embolisms that kills part of the trunk or a whole cordon or something like that. So you want to make sure that you're storing them well. This eliminates the need for all cultural practices. You don't prune. Canopy management is not applied. Inputs are reduced or just eliminated, honestly. And it reduces the costs the most out of these practices. And it also makes returning to production very challenging. It would require at least a year of vegetative growth and very closely watched management, and also suckering and shoot thinning and all this stuff to get to the point where you have pruning wood, and that pruning wood can be used for crop production. So that's at least 2 years to get to any crop coming back. But it also saves you the most money over the time that you're mothballing. It also relies on the older latent buds for recovery, which I've already explained why that can be a problem. This picture here was actually at a mothball vineyard that I'm doing my research study at, and the sheep just got done with it. So you can get that far too if you want. Okay, so pest and disease mitigation. There is a very fine line between mothballing and abandoning. And I think that line is where the pest pressure is, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most people don't really care what you're doing with your vineyard, even your neighbors, as long as you don't have pest and disease pressure that can bleed over into other places. If you choose not to farm, as long as you don't have mildew spores flying next door, most people are okay with that, right? Limiting pest and disease pressure within expected ranges is important, right? And expected ranges is the hard part. I've talked to 3 county ag departments in the past 4 or 5 months now about what constitutes an abandoned vineyard versus a mothballed vineyard. And it is a gray area, let me tell you. I think this statement here, to within expected ranges for a managed vineyard, is key, right? And that could be any kind of managed vineyard, any kind of vineyard that wouldn't get an abatement call in a normal year, right? And that could mean a very organic vineyard, a biodynamic vineyard. It could be something that, there's all these things, and we're trying to figure out where that line is. And I would want to make clear, UC is not a regulatory agency. So I'm trying to help them find some kind of numbers-based way to decide whether this is being managed properly or not. That's all. I ain't gonna go out to a vineyard and say that is abandoned. It's not my job. So what are the approaches to this? Early season pesticide applications. That reduces pest pressure in the early season, and what I've seen work is sulfur, 2 applications of micronized sulfur, and then livestock. That's the only thing I've seen work so far. There are probably other combinations that work, but I don't know what they are. This kind of research doesn't pay well in terms of researcher reputation, not just because of the topic, but also because any results that we get from this aren't going to be read until the next downturn in the cycle. Because by the time I get results from my study, the market most likely will be at a more normal place, right? So I might get payoff from this in 20 years, who knows? So there's not a lot of work on this. Early season pesticide application, eliminate or remove inputs. You got to remember that most of our pests and diseases are reliant on how healthy the grapevines are too. They feed off of parts or pieces or aspects of the grapevine, and they require it to be nutritionally available enough or beneficial enough that they can reproduce and complete their life cycles as well. Fungus is the best example of this, I think, like mildew and especially trunk diseases. The longer you're in drought, the less symptoms you see around this area of things like eutypa. It's still there, but you don't see those stunted shoots, and you don't, it's there, but you don't see that stuff. When it rains after a 6-year drought, that's when you start seeing those symptoms, because that fungus is starting to grow and be active again. So that's not the case for everything, right? Like PD, Pierce's disease. A drought-stricken vine helps PD grow, reproduce, and spread easier. So there's of course exceptions, just like everything else. But we do want to reduce inputs, not just to save money, but also to reduce how good the vine looks to those pests and diseases. Okay, and then livestock integration. I've said this a few times already, but I'm a big fan of this for somebody that's planning on mothballing their vineyard. You can determine how heavily they graze and how long they graze. And you can determine where they graze and what they graze on if you have somebody that knows rotational livestock integration for sheep, goats, whatever it is. Don't use cows. They knock over the trellises. I had a friend that did that. He regrets it. But you can do that. And I think it's not only useful for canopy management when you don't want to do canopy management, it's also good for that cover crop, right? Cover crop sometimes will become weeds. If you're not there for 3 years, it definitely will become weeds. So you got to manage that too. Pesticides. If you still apply pesticides, eliminate the most expensive and extraneous ones. Sulfur and oils are the ones that I still recommend most people use. If you have anything else, it's probably expensive, right? So if you can eliminate it, especially if you're integrating livestock at that point. Still apply things like sulfur and oils early in the season with fewer overall applications. So you save money there too. And then the alternate option, again, is livestock grazing. Make sure you don't mix them too closely together. You don't want a heavily sulfur vineyard and followed immediately by a herd of sheep. I don't think that's good for them. So, but yeah, the goal here is to increase airflow, light penetration, reduce the habitat that's viable for mildews, bunch rots, small flying insect pests, all that stuff. And again, this was the same research vineyard. You can see they have about a herd of about 15. Those goats or sheep? Goats, yeah. So they have goats out there, and that's why the vines look like this. They ate everything except the shoots, it looks like. So, and the clusters. This one is, I believe, 3-ish, 3.5. Well, they left them in there for a week, I think, and they ate everything. Yeah, no, every vine in this block looks like this. So they ate every single leaf. The only thing they didn't eat were the clusters because I think they're too much of that methoxypyrazine still. But they'll probably have them come back and do that again. Because those clusters are reservoirs for overwintering for diseases, yeah.
So if they pruned it down this far, then next year, what's the vitality of the vine?
This is the first year they've done it, so I don't know. We're going to find out. There's two, I'll explain the study in a bit, but briefly, this one is non-irrigated, non-managed, the block that I'm showing here. The other one is irrigated, non-managed with livestock. So this one is the most severe case of not doing anything. The only reason I'm doing this study is because they are doing it this way, and it's very rare to get a chance to do that. But we'll find out, and I'm happy to report back when I actually know how they respond next year.
Because I could see leaving them in for a while to get rid of some of the, but leaving it in like this, so it's down to the nubbins.
Yeah.
The vine's going to be struggling to develop enough reserve for the next year.
Right, and I think the manager, that was their plan, and they might not do this the same way next year, so that there's less reserves for the canopy to grow too big next year. But we'll see. I think their plan is to, because they waited until, when was it? The second week of July to do this. So the vine still got some photosynthesis in before they defoliated it. Next year, I think they're going to wait longer. And hopefully the canopies won't be this large either. We'll find out. Inputs. Reducing inputs, that'll save you on cost, but also decrease suitability of the vine to pests and diseases. Fewer inputs leads to lower vigor leads to less stress from abiotic factors, and also decreased reproductive success, right? And like you get less fruit, the fruit's worse quality, and some of the berries don't even have mature seeds. That happens sometimes. It just depends on how much you decrease it, right? It's a response to the habitat and the resources the pests and diseases are responding to the decrease in those. Because they rely on vines for food. Now, when we're talking about water in this situation, you do want to really take care about your soil type and what you've been doing with your vine. And that's the next slide. But I did want to emphasize desert plants are what we're trying to do. We're trying to make them basically desert plants, the grapevines. We want them to have scarce resources and to grow very slowly. Basically slow them down in time so that they require less resources and they have less disease pressure. That's the goal. And that's what cacti do, right? Like some cacti, like saguaro cactuses, take 100 years to grow 2 feet. We don't want that, but something along those lines. Fertilization, that's probably not necessary unless you still plan to harvest some of the fruit. Deficiency that's visible in the leaves, honestly, so what? If you're not gonna take care of the vines anyways, you can fix that later. The trick there would be, if you see a massive deficiency in some major nutrient, apply that the year before you're coming back so that your shoots are growing well. Otherwise, the vine will be okay, more or less, right? Especially if you don't need the fruit. Irrigation, that has to be on a per site basis and a vineyard by vineyard, block by block basis. And that should account not only for your total goal of reduction, how much water you want to reduce, but also the interactions that water has with your soil. In a really well-drained soil, that dries down quickly in spring, you might want to put in some water inputs if you had been irrigating those vines before, right? Maybe you can reduce them quite a bit because your goal is a smaller canopy and less fruit and all that stuff. But just stopping altogether, that vine is used to a lot of water typically in winter The soil dries down relatively quick, and then you irrigate it, right? So the root system is probably shallow. It depends on the rootstock too, of course. But even with a deep-rooting rootstock, the root system will be more shallow than if you had not irrigated it as much. So it needs a little water so it doesn't just straight up die, honestly. And yeah, okay, to be real with you, the grapevine probably wouldn't straight up die, but you're not going to recover it at that point. Okay, and then if you have a soil that retains water late into summer, like a heavy clay soil, that you irrigate once in a while, you might be able to turn off the tap altogether. It just depends on your soil type, how much water is available, what rootstock you have, if it's a deep rooting, shallow rooting, and then how far down do you think that root system goes. And also, just based on your experience, how much deficit can it take and still grow? Really got to think about this one to wean it off of water, right? But you know, that's something that you can call me. We can discuss if you get to that point. You might need to irrigate no matter what to avoid embolisms and permanent tissue damage. I explained that earlier. That can be permanent, but in smaller cases of smaller embolisms, which are air bubbles in the xylem vessels, the embolisms repair themselves. Well, the grapevines repair them through positive root pressure early in spring during bud break timeframe. If it's too much embolism, it is no longer a functional, viable pathway for water, and it will not recover. So then you lose half of your trunk, you lose one of your cordons, and now that you have a unilateral cordon. You don't want that either. Cultural practices. Type 1, vineyard without plans for harvest, right? So no cultural practices, maybe sulfur, maybe livestock, maybe. If you're trying to maintain the health and structure of the vine, again, just pruning is necessary. And then type 3, I tried to reduce this as much as possible, but pruning, minimal canopy management should be applied. And then, you know, that could be leaf removal, raking the shoots, suckering. That's it. With this one, there's also the concern of the cover crop and what's overwintering in the cover crop. So that might also need to be considered too. Speaking of which, floor and soil management. No matter what form you're doing, some form of vineyard floor management would be beneficial, right? The only real reason you need a cover crop is for erosion control and competition with weeds. That's about it. It's still good to do. You don't want excess erosion, right? What is it, 3 tons per acre per year erosion in Sonoma County if you don't have any, if you have bare soil? That's like the maximum that might be the average, I forget, but it's common, right? So the trick there is, just like you do now, plant cover crops that reseed themselves year after year. Hopefully that maintains a cover of a species that you want, or a mix of species that you want, rather than, you know, any weed that you definitely don't want in there. Mowing, tilling, or crimping soil cover crops, which I've seen, crimping's interesting, but that all becomes optional, right? It's good to manage it. You're not really concerned about frost risk anymore, so there's no real need for any of that. Tilling, okay, but you don't really need to. So it's actually a real good time if you want to switch to no-till when you're doing this, because there's no need to manage the cover crop the same way. But you do want to maintain it as much as possible. You want it to be there. Okay, I got a few more slides. I only got like 10 minutes, sorry. Returning to production. So you should consider how you're going to return to production before you mothball. When you're thinking about return to production, you need primary objectives, and you need to address them. One of them is always, how do I get to fruit production as soon as possible? Like the least amount of years, right? You always want healthy shoot growth in the first year back from mothballing. You want to reestablish growing positions, no matter what they are, right? So if it's head train cane pruned, you want those renewal spurs and fruiting canes reestablished quickly. Same thing with spur pruning if you decide to go back to that. Limiting pest and disease risk, that's just the constant through this whole presentation. And then reintroducing inputs without vine vigor overcompensation, right? So imagine no nitrogen for 5 years, and then you just put on the same amount of nitrogen you always have, it's going to explode. You have to be careful with that. You have to reintroduce everything kind of slowly, including water. And this is what that recovery might look like. Again, hypothetical. But these are how you would normally prune a cordon train spur prune vine, right? You got trunk, cordon, arms, and spurs. During the growing season, this one would look like that pruned image I showed you earlier. And then let's say this is 2 years later. This is 2 years of growth without pruning. So how do you recover that when you're ready to recover it? Well, this one's easy. You just prune it like you would, right? Back to two bud spurs. This one is, I would prune it to something like this if I'm going from a mothball back, like a mothball cordon train spur prune vine back to production. I would put it kind of at almost like a head train spur prune vine. It would become a cane prune vine, and then that could become another cordon train spur prune vine. But upon recovery, it's better to have fewer growing points so that the shoots that are there get the most nutrients, water. They can grow the best. They're the best for replacing tissues that you already removed. And you don't want a ton of excess growing points like that, also because you're going to have tiny shoots and you need pruning wood. The first year back is for pruning wood. Again, you're going to use latent buds, so you're going to lose, and I did this wrong, this should be X'd out. You're only going to have these little ones here, and they typically don't have cluster primordia, so that first year you're not going to get fruit. And if you do, it's going to be like 25% of what you expect from that vineyard in a normal year, right? Yeah, I already went through that. The other option is top working. You can just hack off the head of the vine and then replace it with, if you want to, a new silane cultivar. It's a great time to do that. But as long as the vine is alive and there's no embolisms or very few embolisms in the xylem, you can do this. And the recovery rate's pretty quick, right? 2, maybe 3 years from here to full production. But you don't have to replant the vine. And you don't have to go through this process of cutting it back like this either. And it gives you a chance to replace the silane variety, especially after these market downturns. You might have a different demand for different silanes and different wine, right? So this is also a good option, but prior to doing this, you have to keep that vine alive for the amount of time it's mothballed and relatively healthy. But doing this, you also don't have to try and maintain a 1-year-old bud pool in that vine either, because you're cutting back to here and you don't need latent buds anymore. You have new wood. What are some challenges with returning to production? Again, latent buds, I can't push that one enough. The whole point of using latent buds is to create new wood so that you can have better buds for next year. So it's at least 2 years back to any yield there. They're typically not fully developed prior to bud break. So that could lead to shoots with fewer leaves, fewer clusters, poor bud development, blind buds sometimes in the shoot for next year. You have to be careful with these, and it's always good to have a backup if you're growing from latent buds. Not only are they weakly attached, you get all these other problems with the preformed shoot that's in that bud. Not always, but sometimes. So I always like to have a backup shoot that I don't thin out in case one of them is terrible. They might not grow at all. Sometimes, so their growth depends a lot on chemical signaling, plant growth hormones, right, like cytokinins. They might not grow at all if something went wrong with the management, with how you top the vine or how you cut it back. They might grow from the wrong spot. That can all be a problem. And then getting back to full yields, that can take years. Right? So these are all challenges that will be affected by your site conditions, your variety that you're growing, right? There are some that are known for better latent buds or more blind buds, stuff like that, right? And your root stock as well, typically, right? Because that's affected, that is impacting or being impacted by how much water and nutrients you're giving the vine during that mothball period. And I wanted to provide this as an example. How would you return to production if you did everything perfectly for the mothball? And again, example, this is not fact yet, I don't think. But year one, let's say you're ready to return to production. So you do heavy pruning back to ideal latent bud locations, right? That might mean the latent buds are on where your spur was before you started mothballing. So at that point, it's probably like a 1-inch thick cane at least. So you cut back to where you want your latent buds to grow. You'll find that they grow everywhere. and then you have to shoot them back to the 2 to 4 shoots that you want. Typically, I would say 5 or 6 for backups there. And then you let those grow by themselves while continuously suckering as you go so that new suckers don't grow where you don't want them to. That only leaves about 5 to 6 shoots for the grapevine to actually grow properly. And now you hopefully will get good pruning wood from those, right? You want to fertilize and irrigate to increase vine vigor, especially vegetative vigor, but slowly increase it, right? Don't overdo it or you'll get bull canes with poorly developed dormant buds, which will not help you the next year. Now you have to redo that pruning wood growth period again. You want to allow selected latent shoots to grow without fruit. Don't want crop in the first year. It's the same thing like when you're establishing a new vineyard. Not only does the wood have to grow properly, the root system has to recover too. So you don't want it to be stressed out with new crop. And then dormant preparatory fertilization, that also is good once you're done with the season so that things can remobilize and you have a greater reserve of nitrogen as they go dormant. Year 2, you replace your permanent growing positions. So you go back to 2 bud spurs, right? From those 5 or 6 shoots you grew out. Again, you fertilize and irrigate. You can probably increase it back to normal levels in year 2 there. Train the shoot as cordons or figure out which one's going to be your fruiting cane and renewal spur for head train vines, right? And then new shoots should be allowed to crop if you want them to, but I would say 50% capacity is probably best because that root system needs to recover still. So at this point, end of year 2, you're good on pruning wood. You're good on next year's buds. Hopefully your root system is recovering well. And you can go back to relatively normal production year 3. That's how I see it playing out. Again, it could be very different and someone could come up with a cool trick to skip one of those years. But I'm not aware of a good way to do that right now. What we don't know, we don't really know how it's going to affect long-term health productivity of the grapevine. It could be a lot of different responses that we don't know. Right? It could be a hormonal response. It could be a change in the berry phenolic composition even. This is the kind of stuff we need to research. But for now, we need to get through this period first, right? Differences in successful methodology by cultivar rootstock and location. It's going to change where you are. There's not like a one-size-fits-all solution, but you do need to know what's my site like, what am I missing, or what does my vine really need, and can I get away with providing way less of that? So on. And then, is it economically viable in the long run? Those 3, 4, 5, 6 years that you're doing this, you're not making money on the crop. Is it worth it to even leave it in there, manage it at all, or do you just pull it out? We don't know. Some other good tips. Talk to your neighbors. If you plan to do this, it's a good idea to go chat with your neighbors and let them know so they don't think you're abandoning your vineyard. Like assure them that you care about, the things you grow, and that they don't have to go talk to the ag commissioner and report an abandoned vineyard because you are trying to reduce that risk of pest pressure coming out from your site to someone else. Plan out your return to production before you mothball. That's going to determine which of those strategies for mothballing you're going to do. And if you're willing to wait 3 years to get back to production, or if you're willing to spend the money to prune the grapevine so you can get back in a year or 2, right? So know how you're trying to come back. Okay, and then the last couple slides, preliminary research. So this is what I'm working on. It's a combination study with Mendocino Wine Company in Ukiah and Mendocino College. The college very graciously created a research internship for me. So all the data is being collected by these college students. And I'm very happy because they get to learn how to do research and I get data. So it's 3 blocks. It's all Cab Sauv. The control one is at the college. We're managing it for teaching, so it is being maintained as you would a normal vineyard. Nothing different. I mentioned before, there is one that's irrigated but not managed. So not pruned, the canopy's not thinned, there's no cluster thinning. It's not fertilized, it's just irrigated. And also has livestock going through it. And then the last one is not irrigated, not managed. That was the one that had the severe defoliation in it. So the only thing that goes through there is sheep. Water's off, Fertigation's off. No feed in the vineyard except me taking data and my students. It is going to return to production, but it's being farmed as if that won't happen. So this is the most severe case of mothballing. Like, it's out of production, so we'll treat it like it's out of production. But their goal is to bring it back later. Yeah, there are a lot of weeds. They also have a unique strategy of crimping their cover crop, which might have impacts on this, I'm not sure. But it will affect soil moisture, retention of nutrients, all that stuff. So we'll see how far I get. I just started this year. It needs funding, so I need to apply for a grant for that. But I think the findings from this would have quite a bit of impact right now in the area. So I'm trying to push it through as much as possible until I either run out of money or get funding. Yeah. One of them is 9 years old. The other one is 15. So I believe this one was 9. This one's 15 years old. And then the college, I don't know, actually. I have to figure that one out. Yeah. So they're mature vines, at least. They're not like old vine status either. Okay, so what do I have so far? Unirrigated vines have smaller canopies. Duh. But they don't have a lot of water inputs, but that also means they have less water demand. So we're not seeing the same levels of water stress in these unmanaged vineyards with no water, the one that I'm talking about, versus the ones that have full management with irrigation and irrigation with no management. The one that has the most intense water stress is this one here, where we have irrigated but no management because the canopy is massive. There's no pruning, so the canopy is huge because there's so many growing points. Even though they're sheep, the growth starts up here. They can't get to it, yeah. But the vineyard that's being managed at the college is really normal. It's like 12 bars, right? It's like a pretty normal stress level for grapevines this time of year. So that's interesting. That's kind of an interplay of resources and plant response. We also see that unpruned vines in non-managed vineyards have more clusters, and of course those uneven fruiting zones. There's every cluster or every shoot that comes out of a dormant bud has 1 or 2 clusters typically. So if you don't prune, you're going to have a lot more clusters. They also seem to be a lot smaller. Still running the data on that, but the individual berries are the same size. There's just less of them per cluster. That's all. Up to 10 times more individual clusters. So one of the vines we had, we counted 438 clusters on that vine. Yeah. And I also suspect to see, if it was a prune vineyard, those would be considered primary clusters. Yeah. They're different. They're a little different. So this one's 3 feet on each side. This one was shorter, 2.5, I think. Yeah, so 6 foot spacing here, 5 foot spacing here.
And 2 cordones or 4?
2. Yeah. All of them are 2 cordon. So. Yeah. So, and I also suspect to see differences in sugar loading and pest pressure in the vineyard that has no management, no irrigation. Obviously, there were no leaves when I took that picture, but when there were leaves, there were more reported beneficial species than there were pest species. And that might be because those sheep are there, or there's not enough nutrients. We don't know. But it's a good sign, at least. Okay, so quick summary. Mothballing, that should be applied with a clear goal, and you should know how you're going to return to production before you decide how to approach it. There are numerous approaches to it. You should plan it based on your site conditions, rootstock, and silome variety. Your recovery is not guaranteed either, and you could have long-term impacts and damage on those grapevines. So you have to be aware of that before you decide to do this. You do need some level of management, specifically for pests and diseases. I also recommend a little management for vine health. So I would do minimal pruning, hack and slash pruning. Like go out there, transition it to a cane prune vine, and don't think about, is this going to be a healthy fruiting cane or not? Just cut it to a 2-bud spur, cut everything else off, you're done, right? That's how I would do it, so that your vine remains ready to come back to production. Otherwise, it's quite a slog to get back. Communicate your plans with your neighbors and growers nearby so that they don't feel like they're going to be impacted by an abandoned vineyard. they know that you're trying to manage it so that the pests and diseases are staying low. You just keep them in the loop. And then you can find this presentation here. This is my website. I uploaded this under the section Other Presentations. While you're on there, you can find pretty much any topic you want. I'll leave it on there for a minute. But thank you, and if you have some questions, please, I got a minute probably. Whoever wants to go first.
I want to know which varietals and which rootstocks seem to do better or worse with mothballing.
I do too, yeah.
Okay. Well, you have it on your slide that it could be.
They could be different. Yeah, I mean, if you just think about, I don't know, because this study's only kept SOV, right? And we just started it a few months ago. But if you think about it, it could be a difference in vigor. It could be a response to high water stress. It could be, I don't know, weather conditions or excess light, or, because the canopy's smaller. Could be a lot of things, but I would probably point at vigor, and also nutrient demands as they differ between varieties. Some are better, they need more magnesium or potassium. That's going to probably affect how well they tolerate no nutrient application. But if I were to do a study on that, which I could expand this later, especially if I get funding, Sauv Blanc would be a really good high vigor, heavy producing grapevine, right? And then I could compare that to Cab, which is a very moderate growth and moderate yield grapevine. That would be a really good extreme to compare between varieties. I would just keep the rootstocks the same in that case. I'd probably use the 1103P rootstock because it is the universal rootstock. It fits everywhere. Maybe not the best choice, but it's always a good choice, almost always a good choice for a vineyard. Yes?
So assuming type 3 mothballing or something close to it. At the end of the season, is there a recommendation for either dropping all the fruit that still remains or leaving it on the vine and dealing with it next year when you prune, if you do prune?
Yeah. I would say you could wait to prune to drop it, right? So just drop it when you prune. If you're doing that type 3 where you're doing minimal management, you're probably still going to prune. Leftover clusters can turn into reservoirs for pests and diseases, so it's best to get them off the vine before spring next year, and you don't want them to infect new tissue growth. But I wouldn't go through and have someone drop them before you prune. It's just extra work. Yeah.
An extra expense.
Yeah, exactly. Work, money. Yeah.
So the same cluster, but if you drop it before berries and the rust, that benefits.
If you're mothballing, I don't think it would matter very much. I think actually if you're
It's normally managed, but it's unsold grapes.
so it's normally managed, but you're not trying to sell your grapes, or you are? They're not sold. It would improve. It would probably to a certain, like it's a diminishing curve, but over time you would improve the quality of your grapes and decrease the stress on your grapevine. There is a point where you cut off so much thin so many clusters that the vine just switches back to vegetative growth. So you don't want that either, right? It can help. I would say, like, from what I remember from my readings, 20 to 30% of cluster drop is where you hit your peak benefit for the remaining clusters. If you got more than that, you're just at a plateau, pretty much, of benefit. But if you don't sell that fruit and you don't think you're going to sell it, and you're pretty sure you're not, I wouldn't even bother. I would just let them go. And if you just let them go, that would actually help decrease vine vegetative vigor for that season. Yeah, they would be overcropped.
So you wouldn't go through it in the crop?
If your plan is eventually to go to mothballing, no, I wouldn't, because that would. But if you want to continue producing, then yeah, if it's overcropped, I would remove some fruit just to help that root system repair itself in fall, and also let the vine vigor continue. Jason, are we out of time, or can I keep going?
I just want to keep lining out.
Okay. Yeah.
What do you think about no frost protection as part of this regime?
For mothballing? I don't think you need to. The only risk would be if your region's really prone to frost and you lose that primary cluster, the secondary starts growing. Okay, now you only have one of those secondary buds left in that dormant bud. So if you try to cut back to a latent bud coming out of mothballing, you only have one shot. That's a risk. If it's infrequent frost events, like maybe every couple years you get a frost, I wouldn't be concerned about it. Yeah. There's also the issue of cover crop, right? Cover crop height with that. If you're not managing the cover crop, you might have, more frost. You have a risk of frost. But I thought about that actually as I was making this presentation, and I think I wouldn't be too concerned about frost, especially if you're not trying to harvest the fruit at all. Yes?
You have an existing vineyard that's on cane, and you prune it to spurs, and you get a minimal amount of suckering.
Mhm.
I wouldn't expect any decrease in profit the next year you brought it back to cane again. Do you agree with that or no?
So like in theory, I wouldn't, definitely. If you're not suckering, then probably not, right? Like you probably would be totally fine. If you're suckering and you're cutting it back from a cane to just spurs, you're getting less photosynthesis, so that vine is going to have less carbohydrate reserves when you do want to bring it back to production, which means either more nitrogen or something like that. So there are cases where you would still get lower growth and lower yield, but if you're leaving enough foliage on there, it should be okay to come back the year you want it to come back. Yeah. Yes.
So if you are cutting it back to maybe some spurs, but then the suckers are going to go rampant, how are the sheep controlling suckers?
Oh, they're pretty good at it. Yeah.
I would assume that would be a good way to control suckers, because otherwise you just got this mass down at the root.
Right.
And it's just spend all kinds of money trying to control that.
Well, and the other problem with suckers is when you leave them too long, they create more buds. So now you have suckers there forever, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, I think if you're integrating livestock, I wouldn't even worry about suckering, honestly. They'll take care of it most of the time.
I'm hoping.
Yeah. Especially if you leave them in there for an extended period. Yeah. She had her hand up first. Yeah. Pigs? I don't know enough about pigs. My understanding is that they would screw up the root system. But I've never heard of somebody using pigs in place of sheep.
Talk to Hansel.
Hansel?
They love their pigs in the vineyard.
Oh, okay.
They say pig urine is the best possible fertilizer.
I'll take their word for it. Yeah. Do you have a question?
In terms of abandonment, what can a neighbor do even when you come out? Can you enforce this other abandoned
The abatement?
vineyard to be pulled out?
I cannot. And I don't want to, because my job is to help people, right? I don't want to scare people. You could call me and I can come out and let you know what I think. That would help you contact the ag department and say, look, I already talked to Chris Chen about this. He says it's abandoned. So then that gives them a starting point when they're going out there, right?
No, because I had talked to somebody who had a vineyard, and the vineyard next door was like 100 acres, but it's been abandoned for 5 years. And you can't even get hold of the owner. They don't.
That's a problem.
Somewhere.
Yeah, you need.
And you've got no options to do anything. Or
No.
Not you, but the ag department.
The ag department does have options. Typically, that is what we would consider a nuclear option to force abatement for a vineyard. But if it's truly abandoned, the owner doesn't care, then the ag department will go forward with that. If there is a complaint and there is a viable risk of pest spread. Yeah. Especially if there are any potentially invasive species there or something that might need to be under quarantine, they'll do it immediately.
Fire risk.
I think what they
And
said,
fire risk.
Fire risk too, yeah.
they said the vineyard got in their blocks next door to this. They didn't ever have it. And suddenly not suddenly, but now they have.
Yeah, so that would be something that they would want to report to the ag department and request a survey visit so that they can check for pests and diseases, and specifically the ones that they have issues with. At that point, they would determine if they would abate or not, and that's up to the ag commissioner, Andrew. Yeah. Yes?
I'm sure you don't know this, your study is too short, but what about the impact on the health of the mothball? I mean, the that break. So you
Ah.
have to start off there, you know, of course, if they're great, they're not all that anyway. You think it would impact your quality?
Yeah, it probably would. Most of the compounds we like out of wine grapes for winemaking are stress compounds. They're stress response compounds, right? Anthocyanins are response to UV light, tannins are insect damage, and all this stuff, right? I'm not sure, of course, but I do think that you're stressing out the vine when you are mothballing it and when you're bringing it out of mothball. It's a shock either way to the grapevine. So if you were to compare phenolic composition prior to mothballing, during and after, I think you would get different concentrations and also stability types of flavin-thiols, proanthocyanidins, especially things like that, and then also anthocyanins, the things that respond to water stress, that respond to deficiencies in nutrients. You might even want to look at like fertilization success, right? So shatter and berry set, and what does that mean for your grapes, right? Because if there's the same number of clusters, but half the grapes on that cluster, that's like thinning the crop 50%. It's not the same, but it has an effect that's similar to that. I don't know. I can't give you a straight answer, but I think it would. Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.